Welcome to Ladder Up, a place where we don't just discuss success, but climb together toward a smarter, more fulfilling way of life. Today, we dive into a captivating story that reveals why some of the most brilliant among us still falter. Picture this. You're surrounded by success, knowledge, and the certainty that you're making the right choices. Yet, deep down, there's a gnawing doubt. Are your smarts serving you or betraying you? It's a question that unravels in unexpected ways. And as we peel back the layers, we'll uncover a path to overcoming the traps even the brightest minds fall into. Through this story, we'll explore not just intelligence, but wisdom, the rare quality that transforms good intentions and sharp minds into true fulfillment. Stay with us as we navigate a tale that's as personal as it is universal, one that reflects our journey on Ladder Up. The Paradox of Genius, Marcus's story. Marcus Reynolds was the kind of man who turned heads not because of his looks or stature, but because of the unmistakable aura of brilliance that surrounded him. At only 34, he had already earned his position as the youngest chair of the physics department at his university, renowned for solving problems others deemed unsolvable. He spoke with an assuredness that bordered on arrogance, though few dared to say so to his face. Marcus's colleagues admired him, feared him, and at times quietly resented him. He had a particular way of navigating his world, a blend of sharp intellect and relentless confidence. Marcus didn't just answer questions. He dismantled them, reconstructed them, and handed them back in a form so dazzling that the room would fall silent. Yet, there was a side to Marcus that few saw, a side that stirred late at night as he stared at the ceiling, haunted by an emotion he couldn't name. It started innocuously enough. Jess, a graduate intern with bright eyes and an insatiable curiosity, had brought him a report on a project they were collaborating on. The project was Marcus's brainchild, an experiment to isolate rare subatomic behaviors that could potentially revolutionize their understanding of quantum entanglement. Jess, meticulous as ever, had found an anomaly that she couldn't quite explain. She walked into his office, her nerves barely concealed behind a thin smile. "Dr. Reynolds, I found something in the data," she said, her voice soft but steady. Marcus glanced up, the edges of his mouth twitching. An anomaly? He took the report she handed him, eyes scanning it with the intensity of a predator. "Yes, sir. It's consistent, but it doesn't match our models," Jess continued, her fingers fidgeting. Marcus's brow furrowed as he read the numbers, and for a moment, a shadow of doubt crossed his mind. But then the familiar surge of confidence rose up, overpowering that fleeting uncertainty. "Jess, you're new. This data is likely a recording error or an overlooked variable. Our models are sound," he said, placing the report on the desk with an air of finality. Jess opened her mouth to protest, but Marcus's raised eyebrows silenced her. She nodded, biting back the urge to argue, and walked out. The following days were a blur of papers, conferences, and accolades for Marcus. He thrived on the adrenaline of being right, of being the man people turned to when they couldn't see the path forward. But Jess wasn't convinced. She spent late nights at the lab, running simulations, triple-checking data, chasing a hunch that Marcus had dismissed. And then it happened. One afternoon, during a presentation attended by some of the most influential minds in physics, a visiting professor posed a question that hit a nerve. "Dr. Reynolds, what about the reported inconsistencies in your data set? I understand one of your students raised concerns." Marcus's confidence faltered for the briefest of moments, a hairline crack in the facade. His mind raced. He hadn't expected this. "Those are negligible," he replied, forcing a smile. "Small irregularities that don't affect the main conclusions." The room was quiet, eyes darting between Marcus and the professor. Jess, sitting at the back of the room, felt her cheeks flush as the air thickened with tension. The professor tilted his head. Interesting, because in our lab we've been noticing similar anomalies. It seems they may point to a larger phenomenon. Suddenly, the world Marcus knew began to shift. His mind reeled with the implications. Was it possible that Jess had been right? That he had let his confidence blind him to the truth? The room swam with murmurs, and for the first time, Marcus felt something crack deep inside. A realization that perhaps his greatest strength had become his greatest weakness. That night, he found Jess in the lab, eyes red-rimmed, but triumphant as she stared at her screen. She didn't need to say it. Marcus could see it in the data glowing in front of them. His voice was barely a whisper when he said, "Jess, I think we need to talk." The lessons Marcus learned that night weren't about numbers or formulas. They were about humility, the realization that intelligence without self-awareness was a trap, a dangerous game where being smart wasn't enough to see past one's own biases. The weight of expertise, Leah's awakening. Leah Vasquez stood in the grand hall of the International History Symposium, surrounded by the world's most respected historians. The room was a patchwork of scholarly robes, sharp suits, and the quiet hum of deep conversations. Leah herself had earned a formidable reputation over the years as an expert on the dynasties of ancient Mesopotamia. Her knowledge was so vast that it earned her the nickname the Oracle among her peers. She relished the respect, the knowing nods, the whispered affirmations that followed her everywhere she went. But today, Leah's world was about to shift in a way she could never have foreseen. She scanned the program, her eyes narrowing at an unfamiliar name, Dr. Kofi Owusu, a young researcher from a lesser-known university in Ghana. His presentation, titled Reimagining the Power Structures of Early Mesopotamia, sounded ambitious and audacious. Leah smirked as she sipped her tea, certain that no newcomer could teach her anything new about her life's work. The session began, and Kofi took the stage. He was young, probably in his early 30s, with an easy confidence that caught Leah off guard. His voice was clear, his words deliberate as he introduced his thesis. He presented evidence that challenged a foundational belief Leah and many others had held for decades, that the earliest known rulers consolidated power through sheer military might alone. Kofi argued, with artifacts and previously overlooked inscriptions, that alliances built through trade and diplomacy had played an equally crucial role. Leah's fingers tightened around her pen, her heartbeat quickening with irritation. She could feel eyes glancing her way, as if the room collectively awaited her reaction. When the Q&A session began, she stood up immediately, her voice sharp. "Dr. Owusu, while your research is novel, I must question your interpretation of the texts you cited. These conclusions undermine years of established scholarship," she said, her words laced with the authority of someone who had been quoted in countless papers. The room hushed as Kofi met her gaze, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Professor Vasquez, I appreciate your critique. However, might it be possible that the established scholarship has overlooked key pieces because we've been conditioned to look at the past through the same lens?" he countered. His voice was respectful but unwavering. Leah opened her mouth to respond, but stopped, sensing the shift in the room's energy. People weren't just listening to her, they were listening to him. The rest of the conference moved forward, but Leah felt as though she were standing still. That night, she sat alone in her hotel room, the sounds of the city outside muted by the thundering realization inside her. How many other voices, like Kofi's, had she silenced with her certainty over the years? How many discoveries had she dismissed simply because they challenged her version of the truth? Days turned into weeks, but Kofi's presentation stayed with her. Leah began revisiting her old notes, poring over texts she hadn't examined in years, this time with a different perspective. And there, buried in the ink of time, she started to see traces of what Kofi had described. The signs were subtle, woven into trade records and diplomatic correspondences she had once skimmed over. A month later, Leah sent an email. It was a brief note, but it carried the weight of years. Dr. Owusu, I owe you an apology. I'd like to discuss your work further. You were right to challenge me. Their conversation sparked a collaboration that would go on to reshape the historical narrative of ancient Mesopotamia, co-authoring a paper that earned widespread acclaim. Leah learned an invaluable lesson. That expertise can be as much a cage as it is a badge of honor if it isn't worn with humility. Wisdom, she realized, wasn't about holding on to the past, but being brave enough to rewrite it when new truths emerged. The fall of a visionary, Aiden's reckoning. Aiden Walsh was a name that everyone in Silicon Valley knew. He was the golden boy of tech, the kind of entrepreneur whose instincts seemed unfailingly sharp. At just 29, Aiden had founded PulseWave, a data analytics company that had revolutionized real-time tracking in sectors from healthcare to retail. Investors poured millions into his vision, entranced by his charisma and relentless ambition. Aiden thrived on the high of success, wearing his victories like armor. But that armor was deceptive. It made him believe he was invincible. PulseWave was growing rapidly, and with each new round of funding, Aiden felt the heady rush of validation. His team was loyal but cautious. They had seen the cracks in his decision-making, cracks that Aiden, buoyed by his own hype, couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Then came the pivot, as Aiden called it, the moment he decided to expand the company into a new market, artificial intelligence-driven health diagnostics. The idea was ambitious and potentially life-saving, but the move was risky, requiring significant changes to the core of what PulseWave was built for. His lead developer, Priya, was the first to voice concern. Aiden, we need more data. The model we're using isn't reliable enough for medical diagnostics yet. We should pilot this on a smaller scale, she urged during a late-night strategy session. Aiden shook his head, eyes blazing with determination. Priya, this is how we break through. We need to act before anyone else does. Trust me, this is our ticket to the next level. Priya's jaw tightened. She had been with Aiden from the start, watched him make moves that defied logic, but somehow succeeded. But this time felt different. The stakes were higher, the confidence bordering on recklessness. The launch was swift. Within weeks, PulseWave's AI health diagnostics platform was live, backed by flashy advertising and promises of unparalleled accuracy. At first, the response was electric. Media outlets praised the innovation. Customers signed up by the thousands, and the stock price surged. Aiden basked in the accolades, riding the wave of triumph as if it would never crash. But then the reports began trickling in, subtle at first. Misdiagnoses, glitches, false alarms. A single story on a tech blog highlighted a case where a miscalculation had led to a patient undergoing unnecessary, invasive procedures. Within days, the story exploded, spreading from one news outlet to the next. Lawsuits followed, investors pulled out, and users abandoned the platform in droves. Aiden's once busy office, with its hum of energy and chatter, turned silent. The space that had been filled with laughter and late-night brainstorming sessions was now an echo chamber of regret. Priya was the last to leave, pausing by Aiden's desk as he sat, staring blankly at a screen filled with error reports. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't have to. Her eyes were full of disappointment and something else, pity. The fallout was swift. Within months, PulseWave filed for bankruptcy. The media shifted its portrayal of Aiden from a visionary to a cautionary tale. The man who had flown too close to the sun. Sitting alone in his now empty office, Aiden replayed every moment in his head, every decision he had made, every voice he had ignored. For the first time, he acknowledged what had gone wrong. Not just the technical errors, but the deeper, more insidious flaw, his overconfidence. Aiden realized that he had been so consumed by the myth of his own genius that he had stopped listening. He had forgotten that intelligence wasn't just about having ideas, but about recognizing when those ideas needed to be tested, questioned, and improved by others. His downfall taught him that even the brightest minds could misstep when clouded by hubris. Months later, Aiden reached out to Priya. He didn't know if she would respond, but he hoped. He wanted her to know he had changed. He had spent that time learning not just from his mistakes, but from the people who had tried to stop him from making them. He wanted to rebuild, not just Pulsewave or another venture, but himself, this time with humility as the foundation. Aiden's story spread among the circles of entrepreneurs, not as a tale of failure, but as a lesson in listening. It became a reminder that true intelligence isn't only about being the smartest person in the room, but being the one wise enough to hear when others speak. The quiet power of humility, Sophie's lesson. Sophie Lynn was unlike most of the teachers at Lakeside Academy. Where others saw a rigid curriculum and standardized tests, Sophie saw an opportunity to teach beyond the confines of textbooks. She believed that true learning wasn't just about memorizing facts, but about understanding the world and one's place in it. Her students adored her for her unconventional methods, even if some parents and colleagues didn't quite understand her approach. Sophie had a reputation for turning her classroom into a playground of ideas. Instead of simple lectures, she would encourage debates, simulations, and problem-solving games. She invited questions that didn't have clear answers, pushing her students to think critically and creatively. But her most powerful lessons were not in the exercises she planned, but in the moments when she embraced failure as a teacher and encouraged it in her students. One such moment began with Jake, a bright but hesitant student who sat in the second row. Jake was the kind of kid who always scored well on tests but shrank from class discussions. His fear of being wrong was almost palpable. He would jot down notes frantically, eyes darting nervously whenever Sophie posed an open-ended question. One day, Sophie announced an unusual assignment. This week, each of you will teach the class for 10 minutes on a topic you know nothing about, she said with a smile. The room buzzed with whispers, some excited, others terrified. Jake's heart pounded. Teach? On something he knew nothing about? He raised his hand, voice shaking. But what if we make mistakes? He asked. Sophie's smile widened, eyes twinkling behind her glasses. Mistakes aren't just allowed, Jake. They're required. The assignment set the tone for a week that would challenge the students, and Sophie herself, in ways they hadn't anticipated. When it was Jake's turn, he stood at the front of the room, his knees almost visibly trembling. His topic was an obscure one, ancient Polynesian navigation techniques. He had stayed up late, poring over articles and watching videos, but the information felt jumbled in his mind. Jake stammered through his introduction, words tumbling out in disorganized fragments. The class watched in awkward silence, some fidgeting in their seats. Then, halfway through a faltering sentence, Jake mispronounced a key term and paused, a blush spreading across his face. He looked at Sophie, eyes pleading for rescue. But Sophie simply nodded, her expression calm and reassuring. "Keep going, Jake," she said softly. The words seemed to hang in the air, a lifeline. Jake took a deep breath, the room around him blurring for a moment as he gathered the courage to continue. This time, he spoke more freely, allowing himself to stumble but pressing on. And then something magical happened. The class began to engage. A girl raised her hand and asked a question that sparked a back-and-forth exchange. Jake's confidence grew, the initial panic replaced with a tentative excitement. By the end of the 10 minutes, Jake was smiling. The room erupted into applause, not out of obligation, but genuine appreciation for the effort he'd shown. Sophie clapped the loudest, her heart swelling with pride. Jake's face shone with a realization that would change him. Being wrong wasn't the end. It was the beginning of understanding. But the lesson didn't end there. After class, Sophie found herself reflecting on the exercise. In encouraging her students to embrace failure, she realized she hadn't fully embraced it herself. As an educator, she took pride in her ability to reach her students, to be the teacher they needed. But there were moments, brief but telling, when she shut down ideas too quickly or dismissed feedback because she thought she knew best. Watching Jake, Sophie felt the familiar tug of that realization. Wisdom was as much about listening and learning as it was about teaching. That evening, Sophie stayed late in her classroom, writing notes for a new project. She called it the feedback loop, a monthly session where students would evaluate her teaching, suggest topics they wanted to explore, and share what they felt they needed to learn. The idea made her nervous. What if the students found flaws in her methods? What if they pointed out blind spots she hadn't seen? But then she remembered Jake's flushed, triumphant face, and the fear turned into determination. The first session of the feedback loop was messy. Students, hesitant at first, began to speak up. Some suggested she move faster during certain lessons. Others wanted more visual aids. One student even mentioned that group discussions sometimes felt too dominated by the same voices. Sophie listened, heart thudding, and realized they were right. She had missed these things because she was too sure of her ways, too confident in her experience. But as the session ended and students filed out, Sophie felt lighter, as if she had shed a layer of armor she no longer needed. The changes Sophie made transformed her classroom. Students thrived in the collaborative environment, taking ownership of their learning in ways that surprised even them. And Sophie discovered that her greatest gift as a teacher wasn't just imparting knowledge, but learning alongside her students, embracing her own imperfections and growing from them. Word of her methods spread beyond the school, reaching other educators and inspiring discussions about how humility and openness could redefine teaching. Sophie realized that intelligence alone was never the full story. It was the willingness to admit when you didn't have all the answers that turned knowledge into wisdom. The moment of connection, a crossroads for all. Years passed, but the lessons that Marcus, Leah, Aiden, and Sophie had learned stayed with them, shaping their paths and redefining their purpose. Fate, or perhaps the invisible strings of shared experiences, eventually brought them together at an unlikely event, a conference titled The Paradox of Intelligence, hosted by a progressive think tank known for exploring unconventional ideas about human potential and the traps of overconfidence. The venue was a grand lecture hall with rows of seats filled by thinkers, leaders, educators, and curious minds from across the globe. Marcus, now a professor whose research focused on the psychology of decision-making, sat in the audience with a mixture of anticipation and humility. He looked different now. Older, yes, but also softened by a hard-earned wisdom. His eyes caught the name on the program, Leah Vasquez, the power of revisiting what we think we know. He smiled to himself, recalling the ripple effect that the new generation of historians like Dr. Kofi Owusu had sparked, thanks in part to Leah's courage to shift her perspective. Leah took the stage, her demeanor more open and warm than it had been in her earlier years. History, she began, is not just a series of events to be memorized, but a mirror in which we see our own biases. I spent years teaching history as if it were immutable, carved in stone. But what I discovered is that true scholarship, true intelligence is fluid. It adapts, it learns, and it grows with new understanding. The audience leaned in, captivated not just by her words, but by the vulnerability behind them. Among those listening was Sophie, who had been invited as a panelist on the educational reform section. She nodded with each sentence Leah spoke, recognizing her own journey reflected in those words. Sophie had become a well-respected voice in education, advocating for teaching models that embrace collaborative learning and the productive power of mistakes. Her student successes were no longer just measured by grades, but by resilience, curiosity, and their capacity to think independently. Sophie was here not just as an observer, but as an innovator sharing her insights with educators from around the world. She thought back to Jake, now in college and pursuing a degree in international relations. He still sent her emails occasionally, thanking her for helping him find his voice. Sophie's heart swelled with pride every time she read his words, a reminder that the seeds of change often start with one brave step. Aiden was the last to arrive. The years after Pulsewave's collapse had been difficult, marked by introspection, therapy, and moments of doubt that gnawed at him in the quiet hours. But Aiden wasn't just a survivor of failure. He was a student of it. His humility had turned him into a different kind of innovator, one who built teams that challenged him, asked hard questions, and shared in the credit for their collective achievements. He had started a new venture focused on AI, ethics, and data transparency, areas that he had once overlooked but now understood were essential. When Aiden took the stage, his voice no longer had the sharp edge of bravado it once did. Instead, it carried the calm assurance of someone who had faced his worst fears and emerged wiser. I used to think intelligence was a ladder, a way to climb higher and prove myself above others, he said, meeting the eyes of Marcus and Sophie, who sat together. But intelligence is a web, a network of questions, challenges, and shared growth. The smartest person in the room isn't the one who speaks the loudest, but the one who knows when to listen, learn, and change. The final panel brought them all together. The discussion turned into an exchange of personal stories and hard-won lessons, illustrating how intelligence could indeed be a trap if not tempered with humility and an open mind. The audience, initially expecting another series of lectures on cognitive bias and data, found themselves drawn into something deeper, an exploration of the human spirit's capacity to evolve. Leah shared how learning to accept new perspectives transformed not only her scholarship, but her connections with her students and peers. Sophie spoke passionately about how her teaching changed when she let her students become teachers too. Aiden described his journey through failure, how it stripped him of arrogance and left him with something far more valuable: empathy. And Marcus admitted to the audience that his proudest achievements were not his publications, but the moments he admitted when he was wrong and let others teach him. As the conference wrapped up, the crowd stood in applause, not just for the ideas shared, but for the raw honesty that each speaker brought. Marcus turned to Aiden, reaching out a hand that Aiden took with a nod of shared understanding. Leah joined them, her eyes bright with gratitude, and Sophie, ever the bridge between knowledge and growth, leaned in with a smile. "Looks like we all found the answer to that question, didn't we?" Sophie said, a glimmer of humor in her voice. Marcus laughed, a sound full of relief and warmth. "It wasn't about finding answers," he replied. "It was about learning how to ask better questions." And in that hall filled with people yearning to learn, they realized they had done just that. The trap of intelligence had been turned into a stepping stone, lifting them all higher, not in competition, but in unity, driven by the shared journey of becoming wiser together. Recap of key points from The Intelligence Trap and conclusion. The Intelligence Trap by David Robson unravels an intriguing paradox. Being smart doesn't always mean being wise. Intelligence, often revered as the ultimate tool for success and decision-making, can sometimes lead people astray due to overconfidence, cognitive biases, and the resistance to question their own beliefs. The book highlights real-life stories, case studies, and psychological research to show that even the most brilliant minds can make poor choices when they fall into certain traps. Here are the key takeaways. 1. The pitfalls of overconfidence. Robson emphasizes that the more intelligent someone is, the more likely they are to believe in their own infallibility. This overconfidence can result in overlooking crucial details, dismissing others' opinions, and refusing to adapt. The story of Aidan Walsh embodies this lesson. His genius led him to success, but his inability to listen and adapt brought about his downfall. 2. Cognitive biases. The book discusses how cognitive biases can skew our thinking. Highly intelligent individuals often believe they are less susceptible to biases, making them even more prone to them. Marcus's story showed how even a skilled investigator can let his preconceived notions cloud his judgment, teaching the importance of awareness and self-checks. 3. Intelligence versus wisdom. Intelligence and wisdom are not the same. Intelligence is about processing information and solving problems, while wisdom involves humility, self-reflection, and the ability to learn from others. Leah's transformation from the oracle of ancient history to a collaborative scholar demonstrated how wisdom allows one to grow beyond their initial expertise. 4. The role of humility and openness. Sophie's journey as an educator illustrated that true intelligence includes acknowledging gaps in knowledge and creating an environment where learning is a collective effort. Her teaching reforms showed that admitting what we don't know and seeking input from others enriches our understanding. 5. Learning from failure. One of the most powerful lessons in the intelligence trap is that embracing failure and reflecting on mistakes leads to growth. Aidan's realization that his overconfidence and reluctance to heed warnings had been his undoing is a testament to the power of self-awareness and resilience. Conclusion: the ladder-up perspective. The stories from the intelligence trap teach us that intelligence, when untempered by humility, can be a double-edged sword. It's not enough to be the smartest in the room. True growth and wise decision-making come from a willingness to learn, adapt, and collaborate. The most successful individuals and teams are those who combine their knowledge with the humility to question it, the resilience to handle failure, and the openness to incorporate new perspectives. At Ladder Up, the lessons from this book serve as a powerful reminder. The climb to success isn't just about collecting knowledge, but about building the wisdom to use it effectively. It's the mindset that turns setbacks into stepping stones and challenges into opportunities for deeper understanding. The path to true progress lies not just in intelligence, but in the wisdom to wield it with humility and openness. So, friends, this concludes today's audiobook. We hope you learn a lot from it. Next time, we'll be back with a new and inspiring video. Until then, take care of yourselves and keep working towards your life goals. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Ladder Up,